You're not a real veteran. Stop pretending. It's honestly disgusting. Karen's voice rang out like a slap across the face in the middle of the HOA meeting, every head in the room snapping toward her as if pulled by gravity. The community center's fluorescent lights buzzed above us, but it was nothing compared to the silence that fell after her accusation. I sat there, my military cap resting quietly on the table in front of me, my service dog's ears perking up at the sudden tension. My jaw clenched, not because of the insult, but because I wasn't allowed to reveal who I really was. Not yet. 2 days earlier, I had received a notice taped to my door. It was from the HOA board, and it read, "Please remove your offensive flag display immediately. Your flagpole exceeds height regulations and is not in compliance." Offensive? It was the American flag, positioned right next to a small metal plaque with my unit's insignia. I shrugged it off at first. I'd seen worse nonsense from HOAs over the years. But then came the second notice, this time with a fine attached and a hand-scrawled note that read, "We're not impressed with cosplay." It didn't take long to figure out who was behind it. Karen, the self-declared queen of the neighborhood and current president of the HOA. The kind of woman who uses phrases like, "I pay your salary," at restaurants, and thinks being loud is the same as being right. Karen didn't like my truck because it had veteran tags. She didn't like my military uniform when I walked my dog. She didn't like the way I stood for the flag. But worst of all, she didn't like the fact that people respected me more than they feared her. At the next HOA meeting, she strutted in like a discount mall cop, binder in hand and superiority oozing from every step. I was seated at the far end, sipping water and minding my business. That's when she launched into a tirade about decorum and unauthorized military impersonators creating visual discomfort in the neighborhood. She didn't say my name. She didn't have to. Then came her real moment. She slammed her folder on the table, pointed directly at me, and said the line that set the internet on fire. "You're not a real veteran. Stop pretending. It's honestly disgusting." Some people gasped. One guy choked on his coffee. Another lady whispered, "Oh no, she didn't." I slowly turned my head toward her and gave the smallest smile I could manage. Not because I was amused, but because I had already decided. I was going to let her dig her own grave, and I was going to hand her the shovel. There were murmurs. A few board members exchanged glances, not sure whether to support their queen bee or keep their heads down. I picked up my cap, brushed off a bit of lint and said calmly, "Thank you for your input." And that was it. I didn't rise. I didn't argue. I didn't even remind her that she was publicly accusing a man with military ID tags and a registered service animal. I just let it simmer. After the meeting, she stormed over to me in the parking lot. "You know you're going to get fined. And probably sued. Stolen valor is a federal crime, sweetie." I gave her a polite nod and said, "You're absolutely right. You should report it to the proper authorities." She smiled like she'd won. That's when I knew she was going to regret every word she just said. The next morning, I walked my dog past her house. Her blinds twitched. Her lawn had 2 garden gnomes and a sign that read "Live, Laugh, Litigate." Fitting. As I passed, she threw open the door and shouted, "Don't think I won't have that flagpole removed." I kept walking. I didn't even look back. But I did take note of the car in her driveway. It had a faded bumper sticker that said, "HOA Strong." Of course it did. By the afternoon, the neighborhood Facebook group was on fire. Karen had posted a long rant titled, "We have a fraud among us," complete with blurry pictures of me wearing my dress blues and walking to the mailbox. She even tried to claim my service dog was fake. Comments were split. Half the residents responded with laughing emojis and "Karen, you're unhinged." The other half, her loyal followers, chimed in with concerns about neighborhood security. That night, I got a message from my second-in-command back at Base Bravo. "Sir, want us to handle this?" I replied, "Not yet. Let's go by the book." But even he couldn't resist sending me a meme. Karen's face photoshopped onto a cartoon general, barking orders at a squirrel. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This one was hand-delivered by Karen herself. She stood there smugly, holding a clipboard, and read aloud, "You are in violation of community standards regarding unauthorized insignias, false military claims, and unsanctioned decorations." Then she handed me a formal warning with a deadline to remove all military references from my property. I asked her if she had verified her accusations. She smiled and said, "I have my sources." I raised an eyebrow and asked, "And what source confirms that I'm not military?" She patted the clipboard. Google. That evening, I decided to make a phone call. Not to a lawyer. Not to a local vet group. But to the Department of Defense's Public Affairs Office. I filed a preliminary complaint for harassment against protected service members under federal law. I also submitted documentation to the local police about the ongoing campaign Karen had launched against me, complete with her printed accusations, social media posts, and footage of her tampering with my sprinkler system last week. I wasn't going to play the victim. I was going to build a case so strong that even Karen would have to salute it. By the end of the week, the HOA was buzzing. Karen had announced an emergency verification meeting for the next Saturday, where she planned to expose me in front of the entire board. She even posted a poll asking neighbors if they'd support removal of any residents faking military service. The results? 63% voted, "Leave the man alone, Karen." Still, she was undeterred. She handed out flyers. She told the mailman. She printed out a fake veteran exposure checklist she downloaded from a conspiracy blog. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly known, was that the man she was accusing of stolen valor wasn't just a veteran. He was the active base commander of the most secure military facility in the Tri-County area. And the storm she was calling down on herself was already on its way. The so-called emergency verification meeting was everything Karen hoped it would be, and everything I planned for it to become. She rented out the HOA clubhouse like it was some kind of courtroom, even rearranged the tables to resemble a tribunal, with her seated at the center like a self-appointed judge. She wore a red blazer and a pin that looked suspiciously like a badge, but clearly came from a Halloween clearance rack. The moment I walked in, every eye turned toward me. Some nodded respectfully, others awkwardly avoided eye contact. I could already feel the tension sitting in the air like smoke. Karen stood up and loudly cleared her throat, as if she were about to read me my Miranda rights. She opened with a dramatic speech about neighborhood integrity, the value of honesty, and how certain individuals had been masquerading as military personnel. She never said my name, but again, she didn't need to. She gestured my way with theatrical pauses, like a bad community theater actress. She had a file folder in hand, papers she printed off from discredited blogs, including articles from websites that looked like they hadn't been updated since 2003. She held up a screenshot from my social media account showing me in uniform and accused me of cosplaying to gain neighborhood influence. Someone in the back snickered. Then came the moment she'd clearly been waiting for. She invited a guest speaker, a man she introduced as a valor investigator, though he looked more like someone who sold second-hand DVDs out of his van. His name was Ron, and he stepped up, gave a limp wave, and started listing off generic facts about military impersonation laws, clearly trying to sound official. At one point, he even mispronounced the acronym DOD. Karen didn't notice, but I did, and so did a retired Navy officer in the back row who raised an eyebrow so high I thought it might float off his forehead. Karen beamed with smug satisfaction and said, "Now, we're going to give the accused a chance to speak, if he dares." The room went silent. All eyes on me. I stood up slowly, straightened my posture, not in intimidation, just in habit, and said, "Thank you, Karen. I'd love the chance to speak." I walked calmly to the front and laid a folder of my own on the table. Inside were my military credentials, active duty identification, Command verification from the Department of Defense. A letter from my base's public affairs office. Photos of me receiving awards. Certification from the Pentagon verifying my current role as base commander. And just to sweeten the moment, I included a formal warning from Federal Legal Counsel outlining the consequences of falsely accusing or harassing an active duty service member. Karen's face dropped as I read the letter aloud, word for word. Her eyes darted across the page like a cornered rat looking for an escape hatch. I finished and calmly said, "Now, if anyone else would like to verify my status, the number for my public affairs officer is printed here. Feel free." Nobody moved. A few people coughed. One man audibly whispered, "Oh my God." Then came the applause. It wasn't loud or wild, just a few claps at first, then more. The retired Navy officer in the back stood up and saluted. I returned it without a word. Karen, meanwhile, looked like someone had yanked her batteries out. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish, her hands trembling slightly as she grabbed for her flimsy file. She stammered something about privacy concerns and possible forgery, but it was clear her fantasy tribunal had just exploded in her face. I sat back down while the board members huddled in panicked whispers. Karen tried to take back the floor, but one of the newer board members stood up and said, "I think we've heard enough. I move that we formally dismiss this accusation and issue a written apology." Someone seconded it. A vote was taken. Karen tried to object, but this time no one listened. The vote passed, and the meeting was adjourned, not with a bang but a stunned, quiet wave of embarrassment that followed Karen like a storm cloud. As people left, several neighbors came over to shake my hand. One even apologized for not speaking up earlier. The Navy vet gave me a firm nod and said, "Well played, Commander." I gave him a small smile and replied, "Sometimes silence is louder than shouting." As I stepped outside, I noticed Karen was already in her car, gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. She peeled out of the parking lot like she was escaping a crime scene. The next day, she doubled down. In a desperate move, Karen posted a long-winded explanation on the community Facebook group titled, "My Side of the Story." In it, she claimed she was only trying to protect the neighborhood from imposters and that she was acting out of civic duty. The comments were brutal. "You need therapy," wrote one neighbor. "He's literally the base commander." "Sit down," said another. A meme emerged showing her face photoshopped onto a cartoon soldier with the caption, "Karen of Valor." But things didn't stop there. She tried filing a formal complaint against me with the HOA's legal advisor, who promptly rejected her submission and warned her about harassment policies. The board privately contacted me to say they were considering removing her from the presidency. Meanwhile, I forwarded all Karen's online posts and documents to the military's legal affairs office, where an investigation was quietly launched into civilian harassment of an active officer. Later that week, my security camera caught her walking past my home again. This time, she didn't yell. She didn't stomp. She just stared at the flag, her face twisted with a mix of resentment and defeat. Then she turned and walked away, shoulders slightly slumped. Maybe, just maybe, the reality was finally sinking in. But I wasn't done yet. While Karen thought this was over, I was just getting started. Her harassment wasn't just annoying, it was illegal. And the evidence I'd collected wasn't just for defense. It was ammunition. Because once the military's legal team finished reviewing her behavior, she wouldn't just be embarrassed, she'd be facing real consequences. The kind that couldn't be deleted from a Facebook post. The kind that came with signatures, badges, and charges. Karen's tantrum didn't fade, it evolved. After the public embarrassment at the emergency verification meeting, a sane person might have backed off, licked their wounds, maybe even offered a half-hearted apology. Not Karen. Her ego had taken a direct hit in front of the very people she lorded over for years, and instead of regrouping with grace, she doubled down. By Monday morning, a new round of HOA notices were sent out, some to me, others to random neighbors. all under the guise of upholding new visual standards, which conveniently included restrictions on porch decor, vehicle decals, and flags of any kind. Subtlety was never her strength, but this attempt at blanket policy was so transparent it was laughable. Still, I didn't laugh. Not yet. Because Karen wasn't just poking the bear anymore, she was trying to muzzle it. I began documenting everything with more precision. I photographed each letter, time-stamped every HOA post, and saved her online rants before she could delete them. I even started keeping a detailed log of every strange occurrence on my property, from the strange scratch across my mailbox to the suddenly malfunctioning gate sensor at the side entrance. It was becoming clearer each day that Karen was trying to provoke me again, hoping I'd slip, retaliate emotionally, and give her something to use. But she didn't know who she was dealing with. I hadn't become a base commander by letting petty provocations knock me off my path. Instead, I contacted a friend in the Office of Military Legal Support. I laid everything out, not as a complaint, but as an incident report. I knew how slow civilian cases moved, how easily someone like Karen could spin a narrative, especially if she caught the right person on the wrong day. But when it came to harassment of a federal officer, the Department of Defense didn't wait for court date. They investigated quietly and thoroughly, and when they acted, they didn't knock. They arrived with authority. In the meantime, I began noticing something odd. Neighbors who had previously smiled or waved started avoiding eye contact. Some seemed nervous, others overly friendly, like they were trying to distance themselves from the crossfire. Then one evening, a retired Air Force colonel who lived 3 blocks down knocked on my door. He stepped in, looked around, then handed me a manila envelope. Inside was a copy of an anonymous letter that had been slipped under his door. It was titled Truth About the Pretend Commander. The entire thing was a mashup of half-truths, distorted facts, and outright fabrications, all attempting to make me look like I'd stolen valor, lied about my rank, and faked my credentials. The formatting matched Karen's usual style: overuse of bold text, all caps in the title, and multiple fonts on the same page. The colonel said, "Thought you should see this before she poisons more minds." I nodded and thanked him, already slipping the paper into a folder for evidence. It was one thing to argue at a meeting, but anonymous defamation crossed a legal threshold. And it also revealed something else. Karen was scared. She wasn't just angry now. She knew she'd messed up, but had no idea how deep the hole she was digging truly was. That week, I made a visit to Base Bravo in full uniform, not because I needed to, but because I knew optics mattered. I walked through the gate, saluted by the guards, and made my way to my office. On my desk sat a file that had just come in from the DoD's Civilian Legal Coordination Team. Inside were forms I needed to complete to initiate a formal civilian misconduct complaint. I filled them out with quiet satisfaction, each pen stroke a nail in the coffin Karen had built for herself. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for resolution and consequences. The kind that followed you longer than gossip ever could. Later that afternoon, I got a call from my second-in-command. Apparently, someone had tried to contact the base under a fake identity, claiming to be investigating false military personnel in the area. The caller asked for access to personnel files, identifying details, and even deployment record. The staff flagged it immediately and reported it. When I listened to the recording, the voice was unmistakable. Karen had dropped the HOA Queen Act and tried her hand at espionage light. She didn't just cross the line. She pole-vaulted over it. The base's legal officer laughed when I played the tape. She doesn't realize that impersonating a government investigator and trying to obtain classified personnel details is a federal crime, right? I simply shrugged. Karen thinks she's starring in some Netflix drama. I'm just letting her write the script, so we can deliver it in court. I returned home and found yet another violation notice stuffed in my mailbox. This one claimed my service dog had damaged communal landscaping. It included a blurry photo of some dirt and a caption, Unauthorized canine activity. I actually laughed aloud. The dog in the picture wasn't even mine. Wrong breed. Wrong collar. Wrong everything. Karen was now grasping at straws soaked in gasoline. I decided it was time to move forward with the final phase of my response. That night, I organized all the files, reports, screenshots, and recordings into a digital binder. Then I sent it to 3 places: the Department of Defense's Legal Division, the local district attorney's office, and a military-affiliated law group that offered pro bono assistance to veterans facing civilian harassment. Each recipient received the same subject line: ongoing harassment by HOA official toward active base commander, evidence attached. The next morning, while sipping my coffee on the porch, I watched as Karen strutted by on her morning walk. She spotted me and paused, clearly trying to gauge whether I'd cracked. I gave her a polite nod, and for the first time, she didn't respond. Her posture faltered for just a second. Her lips pursed. And then she hurried on. What she didn't know was that her days of paper threats and dramatic speeches were coming to an end. A storm was rolling in, and it wasn't one she could outtalk, outshout, or outlie. This one came with real consequences, federal repercussions, and a spotlight she couldn't control. The commander she mocked was no longer sitting silently in the back row. He was stepping forward, and he had the entire weight of the law at his side. The morning she was served, the neighborhood woke up to the sound of 2 crisp knocks on Karen's door, followed by the low hum of murmured disbelief. Word spread fast, as it always does when something juicy happens in a quiet cul-de-sac. But this wasn't gossip. It was justice dressed in a navy blue suit and flanked by 2 military legal investigators. I watched it unfold from my front porch, coffee steaming in my hand, my dog lying peacefully at my feet. Karen answered her door in a pink robe and curlers, holding a half-eaten banana and looking more confused than confrontational. But that changed quickly when she read the first line of the official letter in her hand. Her face drained of color like someone had unplugged her pride and let it leak straight out through her shoes. The letter detailed 3 primary allegations: harassment of a federal officer, impersonation of an intelligence authority, and distribution of defamatory material with malicious intent. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a formal, government-backed wake-up call. She tried to speak, to throw in one of her classic lines about being a taxpayer or her rights as an HOA president, but the agents were polite and professional, simply informing her that a preliminary restraining order was being reviewed, and she was advised not to contact or interfere with me in any way moving forward. That moment, the one where her empire of flyers and petty threats crumbled before her eyes, was more satisfying than any public apology ever could have been. Later that afternoon, she made a clumsy attempt at damage control by calling an emergency HOA meeting. Only 4 people showed up, and 2 of them were just there to see the drama unfold. Karen tried to paint herself as the victim, spinning a wild story about government overreach, personal vendettas, and conspiracies. She claimed the whole thing was retaliation because she had uncovered sensitive information about me. One neighbor asked her what that sensitive information was. She answered by slamming her binder shut and saying, "You'll see when the truth comes out." But the truth already had. And no one was buying her performance anymore. Meanwhile, I was contacted by the district attorney's office. They had received my complaint packet and were launching a concurrent review. The military was handling their own investigation into her attempted impersonation and false reporting, while the civilian side was evaluating possible charges related to harassment, defamation, and privacy violations. Karen had no idea how far her web of lies had stretched, and now it was snapping back in her face like a trap rigged with every thread she'd spun. Still, I didn't gloat. I didn't post online. I didn't brag. I went about my days as I always had, quiet, composed, and professional. But that only made Karen angrier. She started making the rounds, cornering neighbors during their evening walks, whispering about how I was dangerous and abusing military privilege. One woman recorded her and sent it to me. Karen was practically foaming at the mouth, throwing around terms she clearly didn't understand. She said I was part of a deep state operation, that I'd infiltrated the HOA, and that they were trying to silence her because she knew too much. It would have been funny if it weren't so sad. That recording, of course, was added to the growing folder of evidence. Each new piece Karen provided out of desperation became another nail in the coffin she was building around her own credibility. The legal teams were now meeting regularly, and I had to attend a couple of interviews with military investigators to verify details and timelines. They were thorough, respectful, and utterly stunned by the sheer audacity of Karen's actions. One of them even said, "In all my years, I've never seen a civilian this determined to ruin their own life with such confidence." Around this time, the community began shifting. The once silent neighbors started to speak out, emboldened by Karen's exposed behavior and the growing support for accountability. A petition was quietly passed around calling for Karen's removal from her HOA position. It reached a majority in 2 days. Not only were people fed up with her vendetta against me, they were tired of her micromanaging, her endless notices, and her aggressive leadership. The board met in private and held a vote. It passed unanimously. Karen was to be removed from her role, effective immediately, pending final review. The day the announcement was posted, it felt like the neighborhood exhaled for the first time in months. Flags that had been quietly taken down out of fear were raised again. People greeted each other without glancing nervously over their shoulders. The air felt lighter, more relaxed. For the first time, HOA didn't feel like an acronym for harassment on arrival. It felt like a community again. Of course, Karen didn't go quietly. She marched down to the clubhouse with a printout of the bylaws, trying to argue the technicalities of her removal. She pointed fingers, made wild threats about lawsuits, and at one point claimed she was going to call the National Guard on me. Nobody even responded. The board president just said, "Karen, you're dismissed," and walked away. She stood there, stunned, holding a binder full of nothing that no one would ever read again. In a final act of self-destruction, Karen posted one last rant on Facebook, a rambling essay about corruption, betrayal, and the fall of society. She named me directly this time, even linked to conspiracy blogs as her evidence. It was immediately flagged and removed. That post, too, was submitted to both legal teams. She had officially violated the no-contact recommendation, and this time there would be no warning letter. This time, she would face consequences she couldn't shout her way out of. The following morning, I received a notification that the federal restraining order was approved and would be enforced immediately. Karen could no longer contact me, approach my property, or interfere with my professional or personal life in any capacity. A separate notice from the DA's office informed her that she was now under formal investigation for criminal harassment and obstruction. She had crossed the line so many times it no longer existed. But the final blow wasn't delivered by me, the military, or even the legal system. It came from her own peers, the community she had tried to manipulate and control. One of her former allies posted a heartfelt message thanking me for my service and apologizing for not speaking up sooner. Others followed suit. The very people Karen had counted on to back her up were now standing with me. And not because I asked them to, because they chose to. Karen, once the self-proclaimed queen of the cul-de-sac, had been dethroned, not by revenge, not by aggression, but by truth, accountability, and the one thing she never expected: quiet, patient resilience backed by ironclad authority. And as I stood on my porch once again, watching a new HOA banner being raised, a banner that honored veterans and community service, I couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, the fight had been worth every silent step. The next HOA meeting was unlike any that had come before. There was no bickering, no self-righteous posturing, and no Karen with her binder full of delusion sitting at the head of the table. Instead, the room felt alive with quiet anticipation, a sense of collective relief and cautious optimism. Chairs were filled. Neighbors who hadn't attended meetings in years were suddenly present, some out of curiosity, others simply to make sure the madness had truly come to an end. I took my seat near the back, not out of habit but out of choice. I didn't need a front row view. I already knew how this story ended. The new interim president, a retired firefighter named Bill, opened the meeting with a short, no-nonsense statement. "Let's keep this short and civil," he said. "We've got some cleaning up to do." There were some chuckles, a few nods, and not a single person objected. The first order of business was to officially ratify the vote that removed Karen from the board. The motion passed without a single dissent. Then came a motion to revise the bylaws to include strict provisions against personal harassment, misuse of HOA authority, and targeting of service members or protected personnel. That one passed too. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about making sure nobody like Karen ever weaponized her position again. When the floor opened for community discussion, I wasn't planning to speak. But a few neighbors insisted. One woman stood and said, "I think we owe Mr. James a proper thank you. Not just for his service to the country, but for putting up with more than anyone ever should have to from one person." There was a short wave of applause. Then another neighbor stood and added, "She tried to tear this place apart," and he held the line. Quietly, professionally, with more dignity than I could have mustered. It wasn't grandstanding. It was genuine. And even though I hadn't asked for it, the support meant something. After everything, the respect of your neighbors carried more weight than any regulation or court ruling. I stood up slowly, walked to the front, and faced the crowd. Not to lecture, not to gloat, just to close the chapter. I spoke briefly, thanking them for their support, for standing up when it counted, and for understanding that serving your country doesn't end when you step off base. It continues in your communities, in how you treat people, and in how you respond when someone abuses power. I didn't mention Karen's name. I didn't need to. Her absence said more than I ever could. As the meeting closed, something unexpected happened. Bill pulled out a small certificate from behind the podium. It was a neighborhood commendation, an informal thing, but signed by every current board member. It read, "For upholding integrity and service under fire, both foreign and domestic." The crowd stood, applauded, and in that moment, the HOA stopped feeling like a battlefield. It felt like home again. The following weekend, something even more surprising unfolded. A small group of neighbors organized a barbecue at the park near the clubhouse. They invited everyone, made it potluck style, and asked if I'd mind giving a brief speech about my service. I hesitated at first. I'd never liked talking about deployments or rank or medals, but they weren't asking for that. They just wanted to understand, to connect. So I agreed. That Saturday, the park buzzed with laughter, the smell of grilled food, and kids chasing each other through the grass. Folding chairs were lined up near the gazebo, and someone had strung up a banner that read, "Community stronger than chaos." A few veterans wore caps. Others came up just to shake my hand. Even people who had once backed Karen were now cautiously warm, many of them offering quiet apologies or simply nods of respect. I didn't hold grudges. Not against them. I knew how fear and manipulation worked. Karen had thrived off it. But fear only holds power until someone calmly walks into the storm and keeps standing. When I stepped up to speak, I kept it short. I told them about service. Not just mine, but the kind they'd all shown by choosing decency when it mattered. I reminded them that authority without accountability is dangerous, whether in uniform or behind a clipboard. And I thanked them for proving that communities could heal if people were willing to face hard truths together. But the real surprise came at the end of the event. A small group of children, led by a teacher from the local school, had prepared a flag ceremony. They raised the American flag while a high school band played a modest rendition of the national anthem. And beneath the flag, they unveiled a small bronze plaque, placed at the base of the pole. It read, "In honor of those who serve, especially those who serve quietly among us." My throat tightened. I wasn't someone who got emotional in public. But in that moment, surrounded by neighbors who had gone from indifferent to united, I felt something powerful, a kind of peace that not even the highest clearance or the most strategic military operation could ever bring. Karen didn't show her face again after the order was served. Her house went up for sale 2 weeks later. Rumor was she moved in with her sister in another state. No dramatic exit. No apology. Just silence, like a storm that finally ran out of wind. The new residents who moved into her place were a young couple with a toddler and a golden retriever. They put out lawn chairs, waved at passers-by, and strung fairy lights around the porch. One day, the husband walked over and introduced himself. "We heard a little about the old HOA drama," he said sheepishly. I just smiled and replied, "Don't worry, it's been resolved." Months passed, and life returned to normal. The flag still flew high outside my home. My dog still made his morning rounds. And I kept my role at Base Bravo, more committed than ever, not just to national security, but to community strength. What started as an insult, a petty accusation, became something greater. A reminder that honor doesn't need to scream. It just needs to stand firm. I never wanted a fight. I wanted respect, peace, and a quiet life like anyone else. But when the battle came to my doorstep, I handled it the same way I handled everything else in life, with patience, discipline, and unwavering focus. And in the end, the one who yelled the loudest was forgotten the fastest. Because in this neighborhood, truth didn't just survive, it saluted back.